All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all. My name is John Efron. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies. And today we are very happy and pleased to present to you Anne-Christin Klotz, who is currently the postdoctoral fellow in the history of migration at the Pacific Office of the German Historical Institute, which is, it's a mouthful, but that's on the campus here. Well, the German Historical Institute in Washington has a sort of a unit on campus here at Berkeley, and is also part of the Institute of European Studies here as well. Just by way of introduction, between 2015 and 2018, Anna worked as a research fellow at the Selma Stern Center for Jewish Studies in Berlin on what is going to be an incredibly important project. It's a 16-volume document collection entitled The Persecution and Extermination of the European Jews by Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1945. And she's also worked at the Institute, the Distinguished Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. One of her other, I guess, activities before receipt of her PhD, which I'll tell you about in a minute, she lived and worked in Poland, where she volunteered for an NGO entitled Action, whose name is Action Reconciliation Service for Peace, where she organized and conducted memorial trips to Nazi camps, such as the ones at Stutthof and Majdanek, for students from Germany. In 2021, so very, very recently, Anna received her PhD in modern history from the Free University of Berlin, with a dissertation on the Warsaw Yiddish press and its struggles among its journalists and editors, against the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany. And that book is to be published later this year. For her research, she's been awarded a number of scholarships and fellowships and grants, like the Sol Kagan Fellowship in Advanced Holocaust Studies by the Jewish Claims Conference, and scholarships from Yad Vashem and the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. She's also currently preparing a source edition that's sort of a collection of documents on these Yiddish travelogues on Nazi Germany, which will also be published by Yad Vashem. And I've just learned that Anna has accepted a 4-year postdoc at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So that's where she's bound for after she leaves Berkeley. And she's also started work on a new research project which examines the role and function and networks of immigrant Jewish, Polish-Jewish Landsmannschaften. Landsmannschaften is the Yiddish word for sort of hometown associations during the Shoah, and then doing this from a transnational perspective where sort of people from their different hometowns ended up in different places. But today she's going to speak to us on the topic of her forthcoming book, and her talk is entitled Letters from the Abyss, Jewish Travelogues on Jewish Life in Nazi Germany in the Yiddish Press of Warsaw, 1933 to 1939. And before she starts, I would ask you kindly, if you haven't done so already, to put your computers on mute. So all we hear is Anna for the time being until it's time for Q&A, and then we can hear from everyone else as well. So Anna, take it away.
Thank you so much, John, for this kind introduction and also for the invitation. Yeah, I'm really happy to have this opportunity to present some of my research with you and to talk a little bit about it. So I will start with a quote today. When I approached the theater shortly before 8 p.m., I couldn't believe that there was going to be a performance tonight. The building was enveloped in total darkness. No sign of a lamp, no movement in front of the theater. But as soon as I had found the door and stepped into the theater through the virtuous foyer, I was met by bright lights and the sound of hundreds of people talking. It reminded me of the Morano caves in Spain, where the Kol Nidre prayers were recited. They must have looked quite similar. Silently and without being noticed, you entered them through a hidden entrance, and only inside you revealed yourself and lights were enkindled. So the paragraph I just quoted is part of a travelogue, which was published in the Neue Volkszeitung in 1935. The daily newspaper was a central mouthpiece of the General Jewish Workers' Bund, or just Bund, in the Second Polish Republic. Under the title The Dream of Jacob's Berlin Children, the famous Jewish Bundist and journalist Baruch Schäffner described his visit to a theater performance of the Jüdischer Kulturbund in Berlin, a cultural association which hired Jewish actors, artists, and musicians who had lost their jobs in German institutions after 1933. In his feature, he shared with his readers in Poland, most of them from the working class, what he had observed. And in a highly descriptive manner, he managed to convey the emotional and mental state of the Jewish population in Berlin 2 years after the Nazis came to power. So Baruch Schäffner was a staff writer of Die Neue Volkszeitung since 1923, and he had traveled to Germany several times between 1927 and 1936. And each time he sent several articles back to his colleagues in Warsaw. And after the German invasion of Poland, he escaped to Vilnius along with other Polish Jewish journalists. And in 1941, he managed to emigrate to the US with the help of his International Jewish Journalists and Bundist network. So his article, however, was more than just a travelogue or a theater review. It is the testimony of a journalist whose own view of Germany was shaped by the identity of someone who felt connected to the Jewish labor movement in Poland, and along with it to a special Mizrach Yiddishkeit, an Eastern European Jewish identity. For the Bund, founded in Vilnius 1897, Yiddishkeit means the preservation and cultivation of the Yiddish language and culture, which had experienced a renaissance in Eastern and Central Eastern Europe since the turn of the century. So the Yiddish language was a constituent element of the Bund's political program and an integral part of its members' and sympathizers' collective identity. But the idea of Yiddishkeit was not only common among the left secular Bundists. Most other Jews in Eastern and Central Eastern Europe felt connected to this relatively open concept, which was adaptable to different ways of being Jewish. So in his travelogues on Jewish life in Nazi Germany, Schäffner constructed and described two different identities that met each other. An Eastern European Jew with ties to the Jewish working class and Yiddish-speaking journalist from Warsaw was confronted with the once praised bourgeois and assimilated German Jews of Berlin, who had by then been ostracized from and discriminated by German society already for several years. So Schäffner's travelogues can be seen as a good example for numerous travelogues and reports which were written and published by Jewish journalists who worked for the Warsaw Yiddish press during the 1930s. So while some travelogues were composed as single pieces, in case where journalists were on the move and merely traveled through the country on their way to a different destination in Western Europe, others were part of an ongoing series, as many newspaper editors would send some of their own staff writers to Germany to cover the ongoing events. So the interest in travelogues from Nazi Germany was at times so big that some journalists would republish their stories in the form of books, translating them into Polish or syndicating them to other national or international Yiddish newspapers. And however, what they all had in common was that they set out to cover the developments from an investigative, ethnographic, and specific Eastern European Jewish point of view with their Jewish readership in Poland in mind. So in this talk, I want to give an overview of the Warsaw Yiddish press and its struggle against the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany, while focusing on the role, function, and writings. Sorry, no, I missed my point. While focusing on the role, function, and writings of 4 selective writers who wrote travelogues in Yiddish. So not only can the travelogues offer us a rare peek into Polish Jewish views on German Jews and German society during the interwar period, they also show us why, how, and which knowledge the authors collected with special regard to Jewish life in Nazi Germany and anti-Semitism in particular. So after all, they shaped the views and ideas of thousands of Polish Jews regarding Nazi Germany and Jewish life under National Socialism. So after the First World War, the Second Polish Republic was home to the biggest and most diverse Jewish newspaper market in the world, reflecting the religious, political, and cultural diversity of the 3.5 million Jews of Poland. Warsaw alone had 5 Yiddish and 1 Polish language daily newspapers, some of which also had additional afternoon editions. During the peak in the early 1920s, the most established newspapers like Hind and Der Moment reached a circulation of around 100,000 a day. And although most of the newspapers were closely entangled with political parties or movements, the majority of the editorial boards maintained their independence and followed their self-opposed journalistic mission to inform their readers to the best of their knowledge, guide them through times of crisis, and function as their spokespersons. The overwhelming majority of Jewish journalists and writers in Warsaw and beyond were also organized in the Verein von Jiddische Journalisten und Schreiber in Warsaw, the Association of Jewish Journalists and Writers in Warsaw, an association founded in 1916 that served as a union and cultural networking hub at the same time. So here the journalists from various political backgrounds, spanning from Zionists to radical communists, came together on a regular basis to discuss the latest news, share information, and promote Yiddish culture. During the Second Polish Republic, the influence of the Yiddish daily press became so big that some of the journalists reached a popularity similar to today's pop stars. The rapid radical political changes, as well as the unleashing of daily anti-Semitic violence and the deprivation of Jews in Nazi Germany of their rights from the early 1930s on, led to a heightened interest in news from Germany among Polish Jews. After all, Germany was a direct neighbor of Poland, and both countries shared a long and conflicted relationship. And even more important, though, was the fact that many Jewish intellectuals from Poland shared a deep affinity for German high culture and literature, as well as a high opinion regarding the place of Germany within Europe. So more than a few of them had actually studied or lived in Germany for quite some time and were friends with Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals living in Germany. So for centuries, German Jewry with its enlightenment and emancipation had been a role model and object of compassion in negative and positive ways for Polish Jews. The political developments and the social status of German Jews functioned then as a mirror in which Jews in Poland saw their own social position within Polish society. In addition, Berlin had become a center of migration for Eastern European Jewry during the 1920s. In 1932, more than 70,000 Jews with Polish citizenship were living in the country. And with the influx of Jews from Eastern Europe, Berlin had become a new Yiddish cultural, political, and literary center. This is also reflected in a special issue on Yiddish culture in Germany in the popular literary magazine Literarische Blätter from 1932, which we see here as an example. As a result of this, every Warsaw Jewish daily newspaper in the 1920s and 1930s had at least one correspondent in living and working in Berlin for the newspaper. However, most of these correspondents fled the city in the first half of the 1930s due to repression and persecution. So the newspaper editors from Warsaw had to find new ways to obtain subversive and decidedly Jewish knowledge from Nazi Germany. And a letter from Reuven Rubinstein, editor of the Yiddish newspaper Die Jiddische Stimme from Kovno in Lithuania, shows how big the interest in first-hand accounts from a Jewish perspective was among Eastern European Jews. So in June 1932, he wrote to Yeshayahu Klinov in Berlin, who had a fixed contract as a correspondent for the Warsaw-based Hind. I quote, "Dear friend Klinov, the events in Germany in general, but also concerning Jewish life, have recently become very interesting and thrilling. The reader literally devours everything concerning Germany. Don't forget that we have a special interest here in Lithuania, as we, like you, are neighbors. And because the reader wants to nobody's writing but those of you, Klinov, I have a request for you. Could you not write us a letter more often about German political and social events and everything else that burns under your fingers in these hard times? You don't have to tell us how many you are going to send. We will receive everything with gratitude. You could send us shorter correspondences or news. So travel literature had become very popular among Polish Jews already during the 1920s. The travelogues that Jewish journalists wrote about Nazi Germany, however, are special on several levels. So, and they stand out from the general travel literature available at the time. The historian François Guenet argued that most Jewish travel writing focused either on places that represented political utopias like the Soviet Union or Palestine, or on places to which Jews from Eastern Europe could actually emigrate to. So the travelogues from Nazi Germany did something very different, as Germany was neither a utopia nor a destination of Jewish emigration. So what they did was offering a glimpse at a rapidly dissolving Jewish world under Nazi rule. And while the journalists also wrote in depth about the behavior of ordinary non-Jewish Germans, Nazis and not yet Nazis alike, they focused mostly, as we will see, on the lives and reality of the local Jewish population, with a special focus on the Eastern European migrant milieus. And combining quasi-ethnographic observations with deeply personal accounts, they often blurred the line between observer and observed, and hence created a form of connection and a sense of unity and a shared history between them, their readers, and the Jews in Germany. So the travelogues complemented the often more analytical and rational articles written by staff writers at home in Warsaw, and helped fuel the wider anti-Nazi protest movement, which flared up in Poland shortly after Hitler's coming to power, with their often literary and usually very personal style that aimed for the heart rather than for the mind. By opening up a window into Jewish daily struggles under the Nazi regime and through stories which were often deeply personal and emotional, the journalists wanted also to invoke some empathy in their Jewish readers, hoping this would lead to a more active engagement in the boycott campaign against German products and culture, and the wider solidarity movement that assisted the thousands of Jewish refugees arriving in Poland from Nazi Germany and sought to document the crimes committed by the Nazis. So until today, I've researched and collected more than 50 travelogues written by more than 24 journalists and writers who were all, at least to a certain extent, part of the Warsaw Jewish journalist milieu and the protest movement. And to give you an impression of their broad activism, I selected here some advertisement for lectures or discussions with journalists who had traveled Nazi Germany and spoke publicly about what they had witnessed in Warsaw and other cities. So according to Jewish newspaper articles, lectures on Nazi Germany were often overrun by visitors, but also Polish and German authorities, who would often send secret agents to events like these, would speak of a sizable interest among Polish Jews. And from early 1933 on, German and Polish authorities even tried to work together in order to suppress critical press coverage on Nazi Germany, as well as the boycott movement against German goods. So while both governments had their individual reasons for this new and unexpected diplomatic friendship, it had consequences for the work of the journalists in the form of repression and persecution in Poland and Germany alike. So in private letters, memoirs, but also in the travelogues itself, we find evidence of journalists having been threatened to leave the country. And during the course of the 1930s, the German government also forbid the distribution of several Jewish newspapers from Poland, because it became clear that Jews in Germany would use actually the Yiddish newspapers like Hind or Der Moment to receive credible and independent information. So apart from Baruch Shefner, of whom we have already heard in the introduction, I decided to focus today on the writings of 4 journalists who can, so I hope, represent the diversity and the heterogeneity of the Polish Jewish writers who wrote travelogues about Germany, and whose writing will hopefully give a short overview of the wide range of topics they all wrote about. So I will speak about famous Warsaw-born journalist Mark Turkow, editor of the Zionist-leaning newspaper Der Moment, and secretary of the Relief Committee for Jewish refugees from Germany and Poland, who traveled Germany frequently. Then there's Shlomo Mendelssohn, a theater critic and essayist who's mostly known for his work as a pedagogue, Yiddish cultural activist, and devoted Bundist, who was, although not a full-time journalist, a member of the editorial board of the Bundes Die Neue Volkszeitung. And lastly, we have Chaim Vital and Heschel Klepfisch, two passionate, politically engaged journalists. And while Heschel Klepfisch was a staff writer of the only Orthodox newspaper in Poland, Das Jüdische Tagblatt, and had close political ties to the Orthodox Agudas Yisrael party, Chaim Vital worked for the pro-Zionist Hind and made an impressive career as a traveling journalist. So in contrast to Mendelssohn and Klepfisch, who both wrote their travelogues while only passing through Germany, Vital and Turkov were sent to Germany nearly every year throughout the 1930s by their respective newspapers. So Vital was also one of only a very few Jewish journalists who were in Berlin right after the November pogroms, and his devastating reports had a great impact on his audience back home. So when Mark Turkov traveled to Nazi Germany in late August 1933, he was already an experienced traveler and well-known expert on German politics. Still, he was anxious about what to expect. So he described in detail how he crossed the border and how he felt during the process. I quote, "I'm afraid of further engaging in a conversation with the German conductor, because I learned from my previous travels to Hitler country to be careful with words and to protect myself for everything alien. The tiniest word which can slip a human's lips and which is against the spirit of these days can become very, very costly. The numbers of border officials was scaled up impressively, and also everyone is very kind to you. You feel that they throw sharp views into your direction. They look at the passports closely, but even more so at the luggage, where they search for goods which are subject to the border custom rules, like a lot of literature is. If you want to be safe in Germany, it is best to not bring any enemy flyer, books, or magazines, except, of course, pro-Hitler literature." So what is striking about the scene is that Turkov gave his readers not only the valuable advice to remain quiet when passing the border, but also specific knowledge on what to bring and not to bring on their trip. This way, Turkov shared with his readers his personal experience and equipped future Jewish travelers with valuable subversive knowledge. After he had successfully crossed the Polish-German border, he went among other German cities to Berlin, where he met with several Jewish friends and acquaintances. To his readers, he explained in great detail the atmosphere and the internal working mechanisms of the new German anti-Semitism, as well as how it was and felt to be Jewish under the Nazi regime. In addition, he devoted a lot of space to describing anti-Semitic terror attacks and the rejections of Jews living in Germany to them. So crossing the border meant living democratic and free terrain and encounter ordinary Germans, but also passionate National Socialists for the first time. Thus, it became a common topic within the travelogues. In a similar way, trains had played a central role in the genre of travel literature already since the turn of the century, as it created the perfect setting for diving into a story, because trains moved quickly between countries and across borders, and they thus created a space in which spontaneous encounters with people from different backgrounds and classes were possible. So not only Turkov, but also the other three journalists began at least one of their reports either with crossing the border by train or with stepping out of the train and onto German soil for the first time. So when Heschel Klepfisch had a layover in Nuremberg in 1935, shortly after the so-called Nuremberg laws had been passed, he couldn't believe what he saw when he left the train and stepped into the railway station. I quote, "Swastika flags, black and bloody, are flying in the railway station of all German cities, but nowhere do they swastika scare one more than in Nuremberg. There, they are not content with the old flags and official flags of the party that scream down the walls to praise and laud the Führer. There you can find as well other inventive inscriptions like "The Jew is our enemy" or "Stay away from the Jew, he sucks your blood." One has to witness gigantic posters with most distasteful pulp caricatures of Jews on them. Shlomo Mendelssohn too used the train as a setting to describe a change of atmosphere the moment the train passed the border between France and Germany in April 1933. While he was chit-chatting with some ordinary Germans and mocking Hitler back in France, his fellow travelers became silent and suspicious as soon as they were on German soil, even more so when two nationalists in uniform entered the wagon. For him, the most, I quote, characteristic trait of the part of Germany that does not yet follow Hitler is silence. You are careful not to say a word. You are ashamed to look into each other's eyes. It is a creepy silence of beaten, disappointed people. Everyone carries a wound in their hearts, but they are embarrassed to open up. So Mendelssohn interpreted the shame and the silence which he observed in his fellow travelers, regardless of whether or not his travelers were Jewish, in various ways. On the one hand, he saw a lot of resignation, especially among ordinary Germans, but on the other hand, he also found that because people reacted differently when being outside of Germany, that there was still some inner resentments towards the regime. On the contrary, many of them discussed the phenomenon of the Hitler followers and their blind loyalty to him. Was it a genuine trait of the German people or something specifically Prussian? And who were the bad people after all? The National Socialists, the police, the party, or German society as a whole? Questions to which the journalists couldn't always find satisfying answers. Over time, as the exclusion of Jews from German society progressed and as the persecution of Jews, communists, and socialists became more brutal and intense, the description of the behavior of ordinary Germans, but also of devoted National Socialists, became more and more complex. Therefore, we find not only stories about brutal anti-Semitic terror attacks, arrests, or expulsion, the travelogues also feature stories of individual acts of resistance and solidarity. Chaim Vital, for example, encountered in Berlin non-Jewish mothers who were so ashamed of their sons participating in the anti-Jewish boycott that they gave back some of the stolen goods to the rightful Jewish owners. After the November pogroms, he was told by several Jews in Berlin that individual members of the SA had secretly helped them escape from police arrest because they felt remorse in the face of so much violence. In this aspect, the travelogues do support current research on anti-Semitic terror, individual agency, and acts of solidarity among Jews and non-Jews on the local level, which is being conducted by known historians like Wolf Gruner or Michael Wild, for example. So this is also reflected in a travelogue by Shlomo Mendelssohn, who, like many of his colleagues, put the Jewish experience of both the Eastern European and the German Jews at the center of his story. In Berlin, where he stayed for a couple of days, he met with many Jewish and non-Jewish friends and acquaintances. In his report, he featured many stories about Jews who suffered under the Nazi regime, making his readers aware of the brutality and daily violence. However, he didn't miss also to notice some changes shortly after the anti-Jewish boycott and before the burning of the books in May 1933. I quote, "It is true that there are fewer beatings in the streets now. The raids of the coffee houses have become fewer. The whole cruelty has now moved inside the houses. Constant inspections. They close down the streets and raid every apartment. There are silent arrests made in secret, then torture, and everybody clams up. Nobody knows anything. I would not hear a single word from someone who has suffered. During the raids, satirical literature has been found, which means an arrest is certain. Indeed, I meet many acquaintances in Berlin these days whose only worry is to find an oven in which to burn their books. Thousands of books are being destroyed, books that for years have been cared for with tenderness. One is afraid to burn in the house. Many janitors are already in league with the police. Also, the ovens are too small. Carefully, the knowledge on where to find a place with a secure large oven is passed on from one to another. Secretly, one carries the books to the fire. Not only books, but also letters are being destroyed." This episode shows that contemporary Jewish observers understood how the Nazi strategies in dealing with the Jewish population was constantly changing during the first months of the regime, between public, uncontrolled outbreak of violence and a temporary softening from anti-Semitic street violence to administrative and judicial measures that invaded the most intimate and private spheres. Up until 1938, the primary goal of the Nazi leadership was to isolate and intimidate the Jewish population, thereby forcing them to emigrate. In this way, the National Socialists created an atmosphere of fear in which no one could feel safe. In his observations, Mendelssohn also highlighted that the Jewish population changed their behavior very quickly and developed behaviors in response to the external threats. So in particular, the behavior of the middle class and assimilated Jewish family was designed to, I quote, avoid any stir or any conflict, as he framed it. By writing about the secret and self-organized book burnings, Mendelssohn, like many others, passed on exclusive Jewish knowledge to his readers, framing it as a self-help practice. Furthermore, by contrasting public books burnings organized by the National Socialists with private ones carried out in secret by Jews, he made visible the perfidy that characterized the first year of the Nazi regime with its violence, laws, decrees, threats, and repressions. However, he did not condemn the behavior of his friends. On the contrary, the Jewish journalist mourned for them and with them, although he, like many others, would sometimes struggle with the behavior of German Jews, which felt for them often like giving up. Therefore, the episodes like these would often be contrasted with stories of Jewish pride and resistance, mostly practiced by Jews who had emigrated from Eastern Europe to Germany and who found sense in having a proud Eastern European Jewish identity and fighting openly against anti-Semitism. Clearly, some of the journalists saw the Eastern European concept as a positive role model in comparison to the, in their eyes, failed assimilationist concept of many German Jews who would rather hide their Jewishness in order to avoid danger. The functioning as a role model discursely ascribed to Jews from Eastern Europe can be found, for example, in an episode written down by Chaim Vital. In it, he described how, on the first Shabbat after the November pogroms, a group of Eastern European Jews had gathered on Grenadier Street, the street which stood pas pro proto for the Eastern European Jewish migrant world in Berlin, to hold a religious service. I quote, "You cannot speak of a reconstruction of the ruins yet. Only the small shuls in the Grenadierstraße could maybe be renovated. But here as well, the National Socialist Authority has given the order that Jews are not allowed to visit prayer houses or come together to pray as a group. A new decree against Jews. The Jews of the Grenadierstraße, however, don't follow the ban, not even at the first Shabbat after the pogrom. They selected a small synagogue and within half an hour they were done with prayers and service." I come to my conclusion. So through their personal and professional experience and networks, the traveling journalists could not only document, but also interpret the rise of the National Socialist regime from a double perspective. As traveling journalists, they were not only outsiders to German society as a whole, but also to the German Jewish experience, as anti-Jewish policies did affect them in a much different way. But as Jews who traveled through Nazi Germany, they were also insiders, with access to German Jewish and Eastern European Jewish migrant spheres who had to fear anti-Semitic violence and terror just like every other Jew. While the reports differ in terms of length and political worldview, they often focus on the same topics, spanning from the behavior of ordinary Germans towards their Jewish neighbors, to the impact the National Socialist ideology had on German society as a whole, as well as the difference between anti-Semitic violence in provincial towns and bigger cities, as well as secret Jewish self-help practices in order to survive anti-Semitic attacks and repression. The Travelogues and press report transport informal Jewish knowledge was circulated among Jews in Nazi Germany. So this accumulated and edited knowledge then shaped the images millions of Polish Jews had in mind during the 1930s when they thought about Nazi Germany and German Jewish life. In contrast to non-Jewish travelogues, however, Jewish travel writers were always critical of German majority society and the Nazi regime from the outset, even if some travelers argued that not the entire German population should be taken into collective custody. But unlike many travelogues by non-Jewish travelers, no description of a cheerful or tidy Germany can be found in the Jewish travelogues. In this way, they took up the perspective of many Jews in Germany, who also frequently perceived the behavior of the non-Jewish majority society in the 1930s as very restrained or else as different and passive. So with specific regard to the research on National Socialism and the Holocaust, the sources can shed new light on Jewish daily life in Nazi Germany and the behavior of non-Jewish Germans during the 1930s. At the same time, these reports offer insight into the perception of Eastern European Jews, head of German Jews, therefore turning around the more established perspective of Western Jews looking on Jews in the East. Because in a near total reversal of the situation just one generation prior, now the Jews in Eastern Europe could live in relatively freedom, while Jews in Germany suffered from persecution. Polish Jewish journalists and their travelogues raised awareness for the danger of National Socialism, and they discussed, by example, different approaches to facing anti-Semitism and persecution. And last but not least, the reports and travelogues can highlight the agency of Eastern European Jews within the context of trying to combat anti-Semitism in Poland and the National Socialist regime. So while for a long time in research and public discussions, they were despised as a monolithic block of passive and naive victims who had no understanding of what happened around them, these reports prove that actually the contrary was true. The journalists did not want to simply seek attention and entertain their readers with horror stories about Nazi Germany. Their primary goal was to find out the truth, spread knowledge, and raise awareness among Jews in Poland and abroad for the dangers of National Socialism, a threat they felt themselves. And in order to enable their readers to take action and make informed decisions about their own future in the face of peril. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. This is fascinating. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we can then read them now. And while we're waiting for that, let me start off and ask you a question. You started off with Schäffner, who was a Bundist, and I noticed that when you had a sort of a montage up of different Yiddish headlines in the paper, I saw one that says "Mitten Hackenkreuz gegen Marxism," and so I'm curious what the political, how the travelogue writers break down politically. They seem to be mostly of the left, but I'm not exactly sure about that. But just maybe I just don't have a big enough sample. But the two or three that I've seen tended to be on the left. So if you could just say something about the political affiliations of the travelogue writers, and then I have a very basic question as well: is why were these people allowed in? Right? I mean, the Nazis were certainly under no obligation to allow in East European Jewish journalists. So that in itself is a curiosity that I'm sure I'm not the only one who has that question, but I'll ask it now. So those are my two questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good questions, by the way. Yeah, it's an accident that I picked two Bundists within the sample I presented you today. I really had trouble to decide on who to present and what kind of travelogue to pick, because they are all so fascinating and interesting. And so, as I said, I collected around 50 travelogues. There are much more out there. I haven't found any travelogue yet, of course. And I think I have a sample of around 20 different writers. And they come from really every political affiliation. Some of them changed over time. Some of them were affiliated with the Jewish socialist movement, but they would also sell their work or write regularly for pro-Zionist newspapers. So it's a really complex and diverse sample. But you are right, there were a lot of Jewish socialists working for the Neue Volkszeitung who were traveling to Nazi Germany, but also for the Hein, for example, I found so many examples of people traveling to Nazi Germany. I would think, or I think that, yeah, by now I have only 2 journalists who wrote for the Orthodox press, who wrote travelogues about Nazi Germany. But for the other groups or other newspapers, I found a lot of examples. And regarding your second question, why they were allowed to enter Nazi Germany, this is also a really complex story. So we have different categories of journalists who traveled Nazi Germany. There were those journalists who just had a transit visa to pass Germany on their way to a different destination. So most of them had like business or family visits lined up in Western Europe or even in the United States. So they had to pass through Nazi Germany. And while they were on this transit visa, they sometimes had the possibility, because they had to change the trains, to get out of the train, and sometimes they would stay for a couple of days and use this opportunity. So they used this opportunity to write a travelogue. Then we have the journalists who were sent by the staff newspapers, and some of them traveled illegally. So they just went to Nazi Germany and it was a big danger. But others, they were really like officially approved by the Foreign Office of Germany as traveling Jewish journalists. And what happened sometimes was that they were, of course, all of them were observed during the time, and a lot of them mentioned this also within their travelogues. And then sometimes what happened was that someone from the Foreign Office would meet with the Jewish journalists and then show them around and try to sell them a different story. So I found, for example, in the archive of the Foreign Office, of the German Foreign Office in Berlin, I found, for example, sometimes protocols from those meetings with the journalists. And then I could compare them, first of all, to the travelogues, but I found also sometimes letters from the journalists where they were writing about these encounters, and then they were mocking the Nazis and saying, hey, he tried to sell me that everything is calm and quiet here and really fine in Nazi Germany, but of course I didn't believe it. So yeah, there were different ways to come into Nazi Germany. But also, as I said, a lot of them traveled illegally. Yeah.
Thank you very much for those answers. Let me read some questions from Jeremiah Riemer, who asks, in 1933, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a Warsaw native and completing his doctorate in Berlin, witnessed one of the book burnings in Berlin and wrote a very moving poem in Yiddish, Tuck von Hass, for the Heint. And he asked, do you know anything about the Entstehungsgeschichte of this reporting in verse?
Unfortunately, I don't know anything about it. I'm aware, of course, that Abraham Heschel was an important figure and that he was there, but I don't know the backstory behind it. But it's an interesting fact for me. I wasn't aware that he wrote this poem, so I will write it down and maybe have a look into it. Maybe I can find out more about this.
In Tuck von Hass, and Joseph, okay, so next question is Joseph Levin asked, did the Polish Jewish journalists have any premonitions of the Holocaust, including of Polish and Eastern European Jews?
I'm can you repeat the question?
Yeah,
I
did the
didn't get
Polish Jewish journalists have any premonitions of the Holocaust, including the Holocaust of Polish and Eastern European Jewry?
Impremonition, I'm not sure if I get this word. This is where my English is lacking now.
Yeah, you know, sort of Vorsichtigkeit.
Like that they could foresee the Holocaust more or less?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is always like a really difficult question because of course they couldn't foresee the future. But from everything what I researched during the last years and what I found out in my PhD, like my answer to this is always that they of course didn't foresee the Holocaust, or also they couldn't foresee the development in Poland, but they had a really pretty good understanding of like what was happening around them. And for them, the developments in Germany was a total catastrophe. They were so shocked by this, and that's why they became so engaged, and the protest movement in Poland was really strong, and they really fostered it. So also when the engagement broke down after a couple of years, the journalists still tried to really bring back the spirit to the protest movement, because they were really feared about the future developments. And they also were really depressed about the developments in Poland. And a lot of them actually tried also to migrate and leave Poland, but they were really conflicted because they also had the self-imposed mission that they need to stay and that they need to be the spokesperson of the Polish Jewish community, and they need to prolong their struggles. And what is interesting is, I would say it started around at the beginning of 1938, and then of course a big change was when the Sudetenland was enacted, and then the November pogroms and the Polen Aktion. So it was 1938 was a really important for their future, for their future hypothesis on how the future will develop. And I would say during this year, they were like pretty sure that there will be war happening sooner or later. They are talking constantly about this, like in their newspapers, but also in private letters, exchanges. They are constantly talking about the dangers of war. And when the war was, when Germany attacked Poland in September 1939, they quickly reorganized and really tried to inform the Jewish community about what was happening on the front, and when the German army will reach Warsaw and so on. And then a pretty big group actually of really famous journalists who were really active in the anti-Nazi movement, they fled the city together with an organized train by the Polish government with non-Jewish Polish journalists. And the idea was to bring them into the East, that there they could like step up again and inform the world. So the train was bombed, and then the group of Polish Jewish journalists made their own way through Vilna, and then there they reorganized in a group, in a like Jewish refugee journalists committee, and there they like took up again their work, and they gathered a lot of information from Jewish refugees about the destruction of Polish Jewry by the Nazis, and they would send out the information to the free world. And like they tried really to make sure to make the world become aware of what was happening. So they really had the self-imposed mission on not giving up and to keep on struggling.
Right. I apologize for the light on my face. Well, let me just sort of follow up that question just with a sort of asking it in reverse. Did you see, or did you detect many expressions by the Yiddish journalists of charging German Jews with naivety did you? I mean, they weren't. I mean, they were less. They were shocked that this happened in Germany. They would not have been shocked by interwar Polish anti-Semitism, right? So did you see sort of, you know, a critical attitude in the press towards what they considered sort of the mentality of German Jews in the face of this? And
Yes.
if that changed over time, by the way,
Yeah.
I mean, between 33 and, you know,
Yeah.
when are the last ones that you looked at? What are the last dates?
So the last travelogues I found were from Chaim Vital, and he traveled in, I think it was in spring 1939. He traveled to Nazi Germany illegally, and it was a big thing in the Warsaw press. Like I showed you one advertisement of it. It was really like said like, this is our famous journalist who's traveling now to Nazi Germany and describing the atmosphere and Jewish life for us. So this is one of the last travelogues I found, but in general, they were really critical about the behavior of Jews in Germany, but also they had a lot of empathy for them, because they were also like really conflicted. And I find there's like really a big difference between when you read like articles and like analysis of the National Socialist ideology or what was going on in Germany, written by journalists who wrote their articles from Warsaw with the information they gathered. So they would usually consume the international press, but they also had approach to underground press in Warsaw, which they would use. And there was also a lot of exchange going on. A lot of refugees, Jewish refugees with Polish citizenship, were expelled from Germany already since the beginning of the 1930s. So they all arrived in Warsaw and other different towns. They came up with a lot of aid committees to help the refugees. And what they also did, which is interesting, is that they gathered protocols. So with every Jewish refugee who arrived in Krakow or in Warsaw, they would try to pin them down with a protocol and ask them specific questions like, when did you arrive in Germany? How long did you live there? What kind of possession do you have? How do you live? And the most important question was, why did you leave Germany? And most of them would answer they fled because they were thrown out, or they were threatened by the Nazis or beaten up. So through these encounters, they really developed a lot of empathy for Jews in Germany and for their fate. But they also made some distinctions between Eastern European Jewish migrants living in Germany or like German Jews living in Germany. And yeah, so there was a lot of criticism also that they didn't saw it coming, or that they let it happen, and that they are not like struggling enough. Everyone wants to try to migrate and flee now. So there was also this element. And also when you look at caricatures or comics from this time period, German Jews were really often described like, they had like this bourgeois German Jewish attributes. So there was this element, but on the other hand, there was also a lot of sympathy.
Okay. So Thomas Gold has asked the following questions. Have you compared the reporting of these Yiddish journalists with the impressions of professional non-Jewish journalists? And some of those reports appear in a book by Julia Boyd called Travelers in the Third Reich.
Yeah.
So how does the journalism of Jewish, I guess, and non-Jewish journalists differ on this score?
Yeah. I have looked at some non-Jewish travelogues from non-Jewish Polish journalists, but also from other journalists around of Europe. Like there were a lot of journalists and also diplomats traveling to Nazi Germany. And it first of all differs always from the perspective, like what kind of political affiliation they had. So of course, journalists who were pro-Nazi, they would write completely different travelogues than journalists with a socialist or communist background. They were like much more sympathetic towards the suffering of Jews and other minority groups in Germany. But what is striking is that the Yiddish travelogues really stand out in the sense that they are always, like from the outset on, they were always critical. There was never someone encountering Nazi Germany who came with a positive view, or with like an open view that the reality could look somehow different. And then there is this aspect of only the Jewish journalists had really like the access towards German Jewish and Eastern European Jewish migrant living worlds. So they really were the only ones who really could talk to Jews openly, because this is also a thing which is featured in Jewish and non-Jewish writings, that people were really afraid to talk openly about what was going on, or if they had been attacked by SA members. So what you can see also in the Jewish travelogues is that over time, like when they arrived, they often would say, oh, it's difficult even for us Jewish journalists to find someone we could talk to. But then when they were longer in Nazi Germany, and when they really would meet with friends, and when they would be like forwarded from one Jew to another Jewish person, then they would really dig up the stories and really dive into like their investigative reports. And through this, they are the only ones who really got like this secret Jewish knowledge. And non-Jewish travelogues, they didn't have those aspects. Some have a focus on like Jewish suffering, as I found, for example, also like by Polish, non-Jewish Polish journalists who were really like sympathetic and really also had a lot of investigative stories. But this is, I would say, the biggest difference, that it was a travelogue written from a Jewish perspective for a Jewish audience, focusing on Jewish life. Mm-hmm. And yeah, but another interesting story is that shortly after the November pogroms, it had become really difficult for Jewish journalists to travel to Nazi Germany because it was too dangerous for them. So I found two travelogues which were published in Der Moment in 1938 after the pogroms, which were written by a non-Jewish Polish journalists who wrote usually for non-Jewish newspapers, but he traveled for his own newspaper to Nazi Germany, and then they were specifically reprinted for Der Moment and translated into
Translated,
English.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Since you mentioned 1938, of course, the Anschluss was in 1938.
Oh, yeah.
And Christopher Jackson asks the question, were there any reactions from the Polish Yiddish press regarding the takeover of Austria?
Yes, there were a lot of reactions. In generally, they were really shocked at like the Anschluss of Austria and also the annexion of the Sudetenland. They were really like crucial points, and this was really like the starting point there when they were talking really seriously about the danger of war. And what I also found was also a couple of travelogues from Jews or also Jewish correspondents who lived in Vienna or other cities, who would send reports about what was going on during that time there. And they are also really impressive on what they knew, what kind of encounters and talks they had with Jewish people who were attacked during the Anschluss and so on. So also really impressive material. Yes.
Okay. Just a suggestion from Jeremiah Riemer, who mentioned the poem by Heschel before. that he suggests that you might want to ask Rabbi Heschel's daughter, Susanna Heschel, about the poem, and I can provide you with Susanna's email address if you're interested. I don't know if she'll know anything about it, but if she does, I guess there are no more questions here. I'll just, maybe we'll sort of wrap it up, unless if you have a question, please put it in, or forever now, or forever hold your peace. But I would just ask one question, and that is, how did you come to this topic? Because it's really quite difficult, at a sort of anything other than a sort of a micro historical level, to find something that's very, very new. This is an entirely new subject that I haven't really encountered before, and I'm just fascinated to know how it evolved. I mean, what first got you on this path that led you to essentially now writing a book that's about to come out on this subject?
Yes, it's a long story, and I have a personal and a professional history behind it. So I grew up actually close to the Polish-German border. I had always a lot of friends in Poland, and also family histories going back to Poland. So I decided, or since my teenage years, I was interested in history, and especially the history of National Socialism, what it means to be German, etc. So after high school, I moved to Poland, and I started volunteering in the memorial site of Stutthof. And there I discovered, first of all, Eastern European history, Polish history, Eastern European Jewish history. Then I started studying history with the focus on Eastern Europe. And during my master studies, I started working as a student research assistant in this document collection you mentioned, about the persecution of Jews during National Socialism. And in this project, I worked mainly for the editions on Poland. And because I already knew Polish, my former boss also suggested, and I started learning Hebrew during my university studies, that I could also think about learning Yiddish, because I had already, also with speaking German, I had already a lot of knowledge. So I took some Yiddish courses. I learned reading Yiddish, translating Yiddish. And then through my work at this document collection, I at one point found, like, I was working with the Yitzko Bika. And through this, I came across the Yiddish press. And then I was at one point assigned to translate one article from the Hind, I think, and translate it into German. And there my mind started wondering, why has no one ever looked into the Yiddish press and what was actually written? There are a lot of rumors about. And then I started researching it and found out that especially in German language research, but also in English language research, there's this myth going on that no one, like the Jews in Poland or Eastern Europe in general, didn't have a clue about what was going on, and there were like no contacts and stuff like this. And I was like, this cannot be true, because it's so close. And also there were so many people constantly traveling. There was a big Polish Jewish migrant community in Berlin, a lot of family contacts, friend exchange, everything. So I wrote my master thesis about the reactions in Hind during on Hitler's coming to power in 1933. So I looked only on in like a little time section, like a couple of months.
Yeah.
And already during my master's thesis, I discovered so much knowledge that I was like, okay, I have to pursue it and make it bigger. And then, I started diving into it, and I found out so much, also so many interesting letters, and there was so much exchange going on. yeah, it's really fascinating.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for telling us the genealogy of the project, because
Yeah.
it's really interesting and it's really fresh. And for those who don't know the historiography, this is quite unusual. And I don't know of anything else that really complements this. It seems to be very, very different. I'll just ask you this last question. Andrea Hellman wants to know, what was the final fate for these journalists? Did any of them get out? Were they all murdered? What happened to them?
Yes, so very different. There were like a couple of hundreds journalists, but especially the prominent staff writers, they were like really engaged in this anti-Nazi movement. And they were really at the forefront. And I told you already the story about the group of star journalists, more or less, or like really like fixed term editors. They went all through Vilna, where they pursued their work and like really did amazing underground work in gathering these protocols and trying to get out knowledge. So out of these group, most of them survived, and most of them came through the help of their journalists and professional networks. They could escape to Shanghai and then to the United States. Other went to Palestine. So most of them survived from this little group. But of course, the majority, they perished during the Shoah and they were murdered by the Nazis. So some journalists were already kind of old when the war broke out and when Germany attacked Poland. So a lot of them were in the Warsaw ghetto then. What is interesting is that really like the journalist network was really for them like a family. They're also telling this in their letter exchanges. They were talking about a family of journalists. So they helped each other, really trying to provide them with financial resources or with visas. Some journalists got engaged in a kitchen soup in the Warsaw ghetto to make sure that the other journalists would have something to eat and that they could survive. So this is like a really emotional aspect also of this journalist work, that they really tried to care of each other despite different political affiliations, which is also an interesting fact, because often you think about Polish Jewry, that they are like really divided and there were a lot of struggles going on, and it was still a big problem. And they also talk about this a lot in their letters, and they were angry with each other.
Right. Did they contribute to Ringelblum's Einig Shabbos archive?
Some of them, yeah. Some of the journalists were active in the archive. Yeah. They would also provide them with information and manuscripts.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. This was a really wonderful and fascinating talk, and I'm so glad that you were able to deliver it to us here in Berkeley. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.